I promise you I'd never heard anything about before my coma. But I came to realize in the years after my coma, as I got deeper and deeper into trying to understand it, that there are many in this world who have known so much of these truths for a very long time. In fact, it's really about a convergence of human knowledge that will lead into the most amazing, unimaginable future for all of humanity. And it's that convergence of science and spirituality that I'm talking about. But it has everything to do with understanding that so much of the confusion in this world and of the actual conflict, warfare, and antagonism has to do with a misinterpretation of religious mystics and prophets, and how that's all been used to separate us in many ways. And yet, the message of the Theosophical Society, and certainly a message I came to through my experience, has to do with the fact that we are all truly one. And this is not just about humans. In fact, it's not just about life on Earth. It's far bigger than that. It has to do with the course of human destiny over the last several thousand years. It all makes sense when you step back and take a broader, much broader view of where it's headed. And I promise you, we're very optimistic about where that's going. Now, I want to take you back 5.5 years or so, at which time I had spent more than 20 years in academic neurosurgery, thought I had some idea of how the brain, mind, and consciousness work. And again, I was totally into that conventional neuroscientific view that is about to disappear from this world because it's far too simple, and it doesn't explain any of the observations. Now, on the morning of November 10th, 2008, at 4:30, I woke up with severe back pain. This was totally out of the blue. And this, of course, is a lot of the story proof of heaven, but I don't want to repeat a lot of that, but there are a few essential parts that I want to bring out. And I remember thinking that if I could make it down the hallway in my home and get into a hot bath, maybe the pain would go away. Well, in fact, I got into a hot bath and almost couldn't get out of the tub. The pain kept getting worse and worse. I was able to pull myself up on a towel and then took little baby steps down the hall back into the bedroom, and I collapsed, writhing in agony in a cold sweat. Collapsed on the bed and just abject misery. Couldn't figure out what in the world was going on. The pain getting worse and worse by the day. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, at that time he was 10 years old. His name is Bond. Those who've read the book will realize that Bond is a far more appropriate name for him than I knew at the time. But Bond came in the room and realized Dad's not off at work, and my God, he looks like he's in horrible pain. So he came over and he started rubbing my temples to make me feel better. So as soon as he touched my head, he driven a white hot railroad spike right through my head. Severe pain. And of course, anyone out there with any kind of medical background, if you heard about subonset of severe back pain, severe headache, you might think meningitis. Well, the doctor was already out. My brain was being overrun with an extremely rare, aggressive, absolutely should have killed bacterial infection, a meningoencephalitis. And I had no clue what was unfolding. And in the midst of this worsening torture of pain, you might wonder what the world is going through my mind. Well, I remember Mom was being ready for school downstairs, and I'm lying there in this worsening pain, and oh my God, if this really gets bad, I might have to go to the emergency room. And if that happens, I can imagine all the lines and waiting and the paperwork, and then finally I'd start to get better on my own, and there'd be all these goodbyes to my colleagues, and thinking that it might take so long that I wouldn't even be home by the time we got back from school. I remember kind of croaking out, "Have a good day at school, Bond." Glad. I was gone from school for the next 7 days. Don't remember a thing. My family actually was resting, so they closed the door and let that happen. And 2 hours later, when they came in to check on me, I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. So yes, they called 911, and the EMTs came to our home, and they came in, smoked some IVs, put in medications, trying to break the seizures, and couldn't do it. So they hauled me off to the Lynchburg General Hospital emergency room. Of course, I remember none of it. I remember absolutely zero the next 7 days from this earthly realm. And when I arrived in the emergency room seizing, I was very fortunate to encounter Dr. Laura Potter. I had worked side by side with Dr. Potter for more than 2 years because I worked in that emergency room as a neurosurgeon. And she didn't even recognize me. All she saw was 54-year-old white male, status epilepticus, in extremis, trying to die on her watch. She knew I was so sick that if she didn't do things very correctly from then on, I might not even get out of her emergency room alive. Now, it turns out that one of the reasons that I'm here today, there are many reasons, but one of them has to do with the fact that my older son, Evan IV, had been trying to get me in shape. He had climbed a 20,000-foot volcano in South America a few months before my coma, and he wanted to take me down there to climb it, so he'd been trying to get me in shape. No mean feat, I assure you. And we've been working out a lot, and that, I'm convinced, was a big reason why I'm still here today. We'll tell the tale. That's very good news for me. It was certainly not very good news for the 6 people who had the hope of that lumbar puncture. Otto was intermittently able to break the seizure somewhat, but then they were trying to get me in position and trying to give me sedation, trying to get me intubated, all these various things, trying to do a lumbar puncture. And when she did get back in my back to the ground, what came out was thick white pus under pressure. And that's the fluid that was bathing my brain and spinal cord. And she told me much later, when she saw that, she knew I was dead. And the reason is she very quickly got a report back from the lab that I had gram-negative bacterial meningitis. And that fact, combined with the fact that I had gone into coma in less than 24 hours, in fact that's taken about 3.5 hours to go into coma, and those 2 facts alone give you a 10% chance of survival from that illness. 10% or less. So that was the rosy prognosis Monday morning, the first day of coma. And it only got worse. They put me on 3 very powerful intravenous antibiotics, ventilator, up on the medical intensive care unit. On the second day, they found out that it was E. coli. Now, a medical literature search on spontaneous E. coli meningitis in adults, somewhere around 1 in 10 million or less per year. It's extremely rare. Spontaneous E. coli meningitis does occur in newborns, but it's very rare beyond the age of 3 months. Imagine how I would defend my level of insurance, but that's just something I have to live with. And it turns out that through that week, the doctors had seen the last evidence of the human part of my brain, the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain. That's the part that's most specifically attacked by anytime you get a meningoencephalitis. And in fact, it's really that diagnosis that's the big gift to it. And it's the reason the medical community and scientific community has taken my story so seriously. And hear how the logic of that unfolds. I'm often asked to give talks to medical groups, nursing schools, med schools, surgical groups, etc., because they get where this is all going. Now, I do have to give credit out here. The nurses have always understood, okay? ER nurses, hospice nurses, ICU nurses, they see things when patients leave this world that have no explanation if you buy into that simplistic birth to death and nothing more, the brain creates consciousness. So the nurses have always done it. I can only speak for myself. Some of us doctors are a little slow on the uptake. I needed a big pumping to get it. But my hat goes off to the nurses. They've always done it. So, continue to. I'm very grateful to the nurses that got me through this whole ordeal, not to mention my family. They were the ones who were always there for us. So I have tremendous gratitude to the nursing community. But it got worse because my doctors only saw abdominal cortex of mine had a remnant of function preventing the emergency room. And after that, there was nothing left of my cortex. Now, it turns out that my brainstem was also quite heavily damaged, even at the beginning. This was a very severe meningoencephalitis, and it really is that diagnosis that is turning through the medical community, certainly in the scientific world, about understanding what happened to me and what the ramifications of that are. It turns out that through that week, they had several scans. In fact, what happened is on the third day, putting all the pieces together, trying to understand how in the world I'd come down with E. coli meningitis, my doctors actually had some very frightening set of circumstances unfold once they did the E. coli. And this is something I explain in a little more detail in Proof of Heaven, but I just want to bring it up here briefly. It has to do with part of my medical history at that time. Before my coma, as to work, I was working at the Ultrasound Surgery Foundation, coordinating global research in this very promising technology, something called focused ultrasound, that I think is really going to revolutionize many parts of medicine. And part of that work involved going to various companies and laboratories that were doing the research work. Turns out one of those was in Israel, in Haifa. So I'd been over there a few months before my coma. And what I remember about that trip is I arrived in Tel Aviv at about 3:15 in the morning, and I got a taxi that took me from Tel Aviv into the hotel I was staying in just outside of Old Jerusalem. Now, it turns out my cab driver was new to that area, and in fact did not speak a language spoken by anyone within 2,000 miles as far as I could tell. And so he was driving around a little lost, a little confused, and in that pre-dawn darkness, there would be cars parked around Old Jerusalem out on the corner, and people were sitting in those cars, and he would go bang on the window, and then they jabber at each other in different languages, and finally I remembered I'd just gotten an iPhone back then. This is in mid-2008. And I remember it had a mapping function on it. I remember putting in the address of my hotel outside Old Jerusalem and the search button, and then showed it to him in this big toothy smile, but he still wasn't quite able to get me there. So he actually set me loose, wandering the streets of Old Jerusalem to find my hotel on my own. And it was strangely powerful for me. Now, there are parts of my story I will get into, but as much as I had grown up in kind of a religious home in a Methodist church, wanted to believe in that God and power of prayer, through those 20 years plus in neurosurgery, there had been more and more difficulty with me to understand how consciousness could survive death of the brain and body. And in fact, I had a decline in my faith over that period of time, just because I just didn't understand how our soul could survive the death of the brain and body. And that was punctuated in the year 2000 because I had a particular event in my life that had to do with a fundamental feature of my upbringing that I'll get into later on in the story. But suffice it to say for now that what happened to me in 2000 ended up putting me squarely into a very agnostic category. So I spent 8 years of my life very agnostic before my coma. And that's why it was strange that in this trip to Israel, wandering around the streets of Old Jerusalem in the pre-dawn with the birds singing and the twilight coming up in the east,
hello. We interrupt this important message to bring you an even more important message. The station ID. You're listening to Solar Centric. Solar Centric. Solar Centric. We hope you have a wonderful Winter Solstice 2022. And we also hope you have a wonderful Happy New Year in a couple of days. So remember, enjoy the winter solstice. I know it's, but just use your imagination with me here. and enjoy your Happy New Year. Also, enjoy this important message from Dr. Evan Alexander and his near-death experience.
I stumbled on the Via Dolorosa and was amazingly moved by the power of that walk in trying to find my hotel. That was the part that I told my family about when I came back. That's not the part that got my doctor's attention. What got their attention was they knew, as they were questioning my family about my medical history in the first 2 days after I got to the hospital, that while I was in Israel, the worst case scenario, that giant nightmare for doctors, infectious disease specialists around the world, had occurred in the Tel Aviv hospital. And it has to do with something called the Klebsiella pneumonia carbapenemase, or KPC gene, that had first surfaced in a bacterium in 1996 in North Carolina. Killed that patient, but it was carefully isolated. The problem with it is that gene confers antibiotic on the host bacteria. And the gene surfaced again in New York in 2000, in Paris in 2001. Each time killed the patient, was carefully isolated in a hospital setting, did not get out, but the word was out there among physicians and all those who take care of infectious disease that this gene was very, very deadly. And potentially, the thinking was if it ever moved into a bacteria in a patient that was a ubiquitous bacteria, like E. coli, and got out in this world, it could create a situation that would make the Black Plague look like a picnic, because it would be so devastating, completely unresponsive to any known antibiotics, and it takes more than 10 years to develop new antibiotics. So that would be just a horrific situation. The problem is that very event had happened in that Tel Aviv hospital right around the time I was there. And so the concern was that maybe I had brought that back, because what my doctors knew is that that KPC gene had surfaced in Tel Aviv and for the first time in history had migrated into a patient's other organisms, because those bacteria are very prolific. They can trade genetic material between species. And in that case, in Tel Aviv, it migrated into an E. coli. And thank God they were able to contain that. That patient died, but they were worried that I might have brought that back to the U.S. And you can bet that had them very, very frightened. Now, as the week went on, and did not respond to antibiotics, that was their big concern. Now, it turns out by day 7, things were starting to turn around finally. My white blood cell count was coming down a little bit, but the problem was I had no neurologic function left at that time. They were at a point of doing brain death criteria. That was the next step. And it had only gotten worse during the week, so in fact they held a conference that Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. They had a conference with my family where they said, well, you know, we started this week with a 10% chance of survival. Now we're down to a 2% chance of survival. And if he's in that lucky 2%, best case scenario, that he'll spend a month or 2 in this hospital, then be transferred to a nursing home in a persistent vegetative state and die in coma a few months later. So the recommendation was, why don't we stop the antibiotics? And that was indeed what they did. Now, it turns out it was a few hours after that I started coming back to this world. And my doctors were right. I was extremely ill from this and should not have survived at all, and should not have had any experience at all, much less any memories of experience. And that's one of the reasons why my story has captivated the scientific and medical worlds by storm, is because I had an unbelievably robust, hyper-real experience that I'm going to describe to you in some detail. And it should never have happened according to everything that we know. Now, when I did come back, my brain was wrecked. No words, no language, no recognition of any of those beings around the hospital bed. My mother, sisters, sons. Absolutely no clue what this universe was. But I knew where I'd been. I remembered completely, full well, the journey I was returning from, even though I remembered absolutely nothing during any part of it of Eben Alexander's life before coma. No words, no language, none of the religious concepts, certainly none of the knowledge of all those years spent in neurosurgery studying brain, mind, and consciousness. Every bit of that was completely deleted for this entire experience, which makes it a little bit atypical when you look at other near-death experiences. But I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander, and it took me many months to even begin to glimpse how and why that might have been the case. By default, understanding early on was that, of course, I had this severe bacterial meningitis that destroyed the neocortex, the human part of my brain. So it made perfect sense that I didn't have any memories or knowing of my life before coma. Turns out the reasons for it go quite a bit deeper than that. But that was my working model for a long time, that such a severe neocortical destruction would erase all the memories. But it turns out that that set the stage for a very powerful journey with tremendous lessons in it. Now, what I knew full well when I came back was the entire journey. That journey started in a place that I call the earthworm's eye view. Very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being underground or in dirty jello. I remember this sensation of lots of roots or blood vessels around me. And almost I can feel them just thinking about what it was like, and I could sense them way off into the distance. Although I had no body image at any point of this journey. I was just a piece of awareness experiencing all this. But in that coarse, horrible, ugly underground realm that was completely unresponsive, even though I had no words, no language, I could still wonder. What? Where? But never a flicker of response to that curiosity. Now, many, when I would give these talks early on, they would say, well, was that earthworm's eye view, which is what I call that ugly thing began, well, or purgatory? I think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And this was none of that. That curiosity was never answered with any flicker of anything. And looking back on it, I think that very coarse, primitive, murky existence was the very best consciousness my physical brain could muster when it was soaking in pus and being destroyed by this primitive E. coli infection. Now, it turns out that if you would ask me before my coma, well, if that primitive earthworm eye view is what your brain is mustering right now with this devastating infection as it progresses and melts the outer surface, the human part of your brain, what's the next step? I would have told you, well, obviously, the next step is a state of no awareness at all. That is the biggest shock of the journey, is that, in fact, as this all progressed, and it did seem that earthworm eye view went on for eons, because I promise you I had no memory moment to moment of time. I had absolutely zero memory of my life before coma, not the tiniest bit. And so it did seem to go on for a very long time. Good news is it did not last forever. And what happened next was the slowly spinning white light that came towards me, a very clear and pure light that had fine white and gold tendrils off of it. And this white light came towards me, and the best part about it is it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And it turns out that I had been aware of sound in that earthworm eye view, that very primitive existence. The sound was a pounding, monotonous sound, like someone smashing on an anvil over and over again. Just a steady rhythm. And it was a very cursing sound. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. Absolutely beautiful. And as you will hear, sound, music, vibration, frequency is the way that our souls transcend in these levels. It's one of the reasons why sound, hymns, chants have been used for thousands of years to help engender deep transcendental conscious states in any kind of spiritual broadening of consciousness, religious ceremony, etc. And that sound is absolutely essential to the work I do now. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but that melody, spinning melody as I called it, came towards me, and it opened up like a rip in that ugly earthworm eye view, and it was a rip that opened valley. And I remember ascending up into this valley, up into this brilliant greenery, lush with life, absolutely fertile. And I had no body awareness, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck on a butterfly wing. Now, this is not a butterfly like some entomologist here on Earth can give you genus to species. This was the real deal. And butterflies in that realm, just like we often have dragonflies, butterflies, and hummingbirds that are messengers from that realm, from souls of the departed loved ones. And there are thousands of stories out there. I'm sure there's some in this room about that very phenomenon. But in that realm, butterflies are far more powerful and amazing than they are in this one. And I was a speck of awareness, and it turns out on this wing of this butterfly, this was one of millions of butterflies, and they were looping and swirling in this beautiful river of love and color and light beyond description. And I remember how we would dip down and go through that lush greenery, and there would be flowers and blossoms, buds on trees that would open up even as we flew by. I remember the rich textures and colors beyond the rainbow. And so beautiful in the valley. As we would come up and ascend above all that greenery, I could see that there were hundreds of souls dancing. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, as I came back to this world and was trying to record the whole experience, I described them as being dressed in peasant garb, very simple clothing, yet beautiful colors, and tremendous joy and merriment. There were lots of children playing and dogs jumping, and it was just a wonderful festival. And it was all being fueled because up above, in the velvety black skies above, were pure spiritual beings, orbs of golden light, swooping and swirling in formation, leaving sparkling golden trails, emanating these hymns, chants, anthems, powerful like a tsunami wave, crescendo after crescendo after crescendo of the most beautiful music, waves washing through me. And that's what was fueling this incredible joy and mirth going on in this Gateway Valley, as I came to call it. Now, the important thing to understand is that that Gateway Valley was much more real than this world. Far sharper, crisper, and more real than this. This is very human by comparison. That was a deep, deep mystery for a long time, trying to understand that ultimate reality. It's very hard to put it into words. And when I would first describe that to people and talk about the ultimate reality, people would say, well, is that like high-def TV? Well, it's a lot more than that. The way we know things there, you don't see with the eyes, you don't hear with the ears, you become others to feel the emotional power of existence. In fact, often if you get into the near-death experience literature, you read a lot about the tens of thousands of life reviews that people describe. You know that old saying, your life flashes before your eyes? Well, it's very true, and that's what near-death experiencers tell you, is that you go through every bit of your life, all the crucial parts that are there to teach you about the lessons of good and bad, that are still residual lessons for you to learn, to help you and your higher soul and your soulmates, your soul group. And the judgment is not by any higher power, it's by our higher soul. That's what's doing the judging in that realm. And that's when we go through those life reviews. It's not some vague, sepia-tinted memory. These are sharp, clear, crisp, absolute reliving the events more powerfully than when we live through them in the earthly realm. And we have to feel the power of our decisions, the emotional impact on our fellow beings. So if we live the life handing out pain and suffering to others, we have to feel that in that life review. But we have to feel it far more sharply than they felt it here in the material realm, which is a pale, dim reflection of that far more real and crisp world, that gateway realm between lives. We unite with our soul, and when we reunite with our soulmates, in this glaring, beautiful, all-loving light of that infinitely powerful God, that's the way exactly what that's all about, that unconditional love. And the reason it's so important for all of us to get is because we're here in soul school to learn those lessons of that love. And what we find is that unconditional love has infinite power to heal. And I think see that the hardship of this life, and I thought it was a nurse and a doctor, felt very much into illness and injury. Their gifts, their opportunity for growth in our soul. We are all here members of soul groups to do this growing. And when I talk about soul mates, I'm not just talking about that love of your life. I also think to speak of all of those who I've seen before my family I've never seen. Someone who is in my way, preventing me from getting back in this life. It's a very important to see the power of that love, that unconditional love to heal. It heals the individual, it heals the soul group, it heals all of humanity, it heals life all around this world, and it heals consciousness throughout the universe. It makes us part of our joint as market support. Now, it turns out that in that beautiful gateway valley, that Oakville Valley, that beautiful butterfly one, the best whole valley is this blue. Beautiful blue. Simplicity of that phrase lead you astray. It is infinitely powerful. It's something that we all know. Because all of our souls have been there before and go back to cycle through again and again in ourselves. Now, it's very important to understand that the concept is not and one of the reasons that we like to use is put memories of concentrate so powerful in the concept.
Centric. Solar Centric.
Look delicious on your face. Serve them to unwanted guests. Stuff the market with the rest. Look delicious on your face. Serve them to unwanted guests. Stuff the mattress with the rest.
Attention everyone, this is an emergency broadcast. The unpleasant noise you're about to hear coming from your radio is not a mistake. Please do not turn off your radio, but turn up the volume on your receiver as high as it can go, so that you can make the sound we broadcast as loud as possible. Attention everyone, this is an emergency broadcast. The unpleasant noise you are about to hear coming from your radio is not a mistake. Please do not turn off your radio, but turn up the volume on your receiver as high as it can go, so that you can make the sound we broadcast as loud as possible.
Hello. Hey, is this thing on? You quiet back there. I think it's on. Okay. Happy Lunar Solstice 2022. Happy New Year for 2022 to 2023. And I wish you a happy Friday night. And this is Solar Centric transmitting with a 1,000 watt amplified home breeze transmitter from our 50-foot yacht in the Pacific Ocean. Bless you all and have a good night. This is Solar Centric signing off. Solar Centric.